A very warm welcome to you all to this news hour on Equinoxe Television, live from our headquarters in Cameroon's economic capital, Douala. I am Bable Jonathan. In our top stories in this edition of the 6 p.m. newscast on Equinoxe Television, chaos hits Fumban in the west region of the Republic of Cameroon. The locality's court of first instance is set ablaze by angry inhabitants who went protesting against allegations that a sick inmate was denied medical attention, which led to his death. And in news out of the Republic of Cameroon, some opposition leaders in neighboring Chad reject a transitional government named by the Transitional Military Council, led by the president of that council, who is the son of late President Idriss Déby Itno. And some opposition leaders, including Salih Kebzabo, have approved of that transitional government, but others qualify it as a coup, demanding for the appointment of a civilian president. Stay with us. Chaos hit Fumban today. Fumban, a locality in the west region of the Republic of Cameroon, and some inhabitants took to the streets protesting against what they consider as denial of medical attention for a sick inmate who died, and they set ablaze the court of first instance of that locality. Details with Sumanjik and Gabriel.
An unpredicted Monday afternoon in Fumbot, west region of Cameroon. The court of first instance is set ablaze by angry population. According to reports on the ground, it is alleged that the population went on rampage after a man died while in custody. The man who is selling drugs along the roadside in Fumbot have been sick while in prison. All attempts made by the population to influence the state council to enable his release for hospital attention failed. Later Monday afternoon, information reached the population about the demise of the roadside medicine vendor and corpse already deposited at the mortuary. The population went mad, and their first stopover was at the Fumbot Court of First Instance, where they set the courthouse on fire before rushing to the mortuary to remove the corpse of the man. His body will be later displayed at the Makiza roundabout in Fumbot. At the time the population invaded the Fumbot Court of First Instance, all magistrates were reported to have run out for their lives. Security forces were also deployed from other sectors to aid their colleagues in Fumbot.
The court of first instance of Fumbot, and not Fumban, said earlier, set ablaze by angry inhabitants protesting over allegations of denial of medical attention for a sick inmate who later died in detention. We'll be updating you on that happening in Fumbot in the west region of the Republic of Cameroon. Now onto the crisis-stricken northwest and southwest regions of the Republic of Cameroon. The situation has continued deteriorating, with explosive devices becoming almost the order of the day, exploding here and there at close intervals of time, maiming, killing and destroying. And according to the senior associate for African Regional Director of the National Democratic Institute based in Washington, D.C., Dr. Christopher Fomonyo, there are no two ways out of the armed conflict in the northwest and southwest regions of the country but negotiation. The only way out, according to him, is negotiation. The government of the Republic of Cameroon, he says, has to negotiate with the English-speaking population of the northwest and southwest regions of the country, notably the leaders, of course. Leaders. In this extract, he spoke to me in the inside.
Negotiations were the best approach to bring all the parties around the table to figure out where we went wrong in the past, figure out what our differences are, and together figure out a way out. I have continued to say so. And so today's developments, the escalation that we now see with the utilization of more sophisticated weapons than the dead guns that we saw in the early months of 2017, with the utilization of explosive devices, this escalation is showing that we are on the wrong path with regards to bringing a definite and sustained solution to this conflict. And that the only way out is going to be through negotiations that would allow a cessation of hostilities and a formal declaration that the war is over. There is a level of anger and frustration and bitterness that is well founded, because we're all humans and we've got feelings, that makes me realize, and should make every reasonable person come to the conclusion that we're not going to all be able to just sit in one room and sing from the hymnary and all be happy people. The frustrations are legitimate and they are real. And so under those kinds of circumstances, you're going to need a third party who can play a mediation role, who can facilitate the discussions, who can hold hands and let people put their emotions aside and look at the genuine grievances that Anglophones have. Without that kind of third-party mediation, it is difficult for me to see how just another national conference with an agenda that's being defined out of Yaoundé is going to get to the root causes of this issue and to bring the solutions that we all expect and that can bring peace to the Northwest and Southwest region.
And with regards to the degree of distrust between the two parties, especially on the side of the Yaoundé administration, Dr. Christopher Fomenyo thinks that it is imperative, it is indispensable to have a third party who is going to mediate between the two parties. Take a listen to him.
Does anybody think that the Minister of Defense, for example, is going to sit in the same room with Field Marshal Arab Bialem and talk about peace and justice and security? Does anyone think that people who have spent the last 4 years vilifying each other, calling each other's names, are going to all of a sudden pack their appellations at the door and just sit down amongst themselves and come out with a peaceful resolution that will bring peace and justice? And we've seen third-party mediation work for other African countries that have had conflict. I have participated in some of these third-party mediation efforts myself. We saw them work in the DRC, that's Democratic Republic of Congo. We've seen them working in places like Mali and even Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. I cannot understand why there's a resistance for us to get third-party friends to help us create an environment where we can sit down and sort out our differences through a negotiated process so peace and justice can prevail.
Dr. Christopher Fomenyo speaking to the Insight from Washington, D.C. Now we're going to talk about World Press Freedom Day. Today is that day consecrated to pressmen, workers of the media across the world. And of course, today is being observed as World Press Freedom Day at a time when there is a general outcry from across the Republic of Cameroon and even the African continent over violation of the right to freedom of expression, not only of citizens but of journalists, reporters who are being intimidated, who are arrested, who are tortured, who are detained, and who are not given fair trial. This is the cry that is coming from journalists, trade unions, coming from journalists across the African continent and the rest of the world. And today we are receiving one of the persons who have been fighting for the right of journalists to be respected, for press freedom to be respected. Angela Quintal of the Committee to Protect Journalists is joining us from New York, United States of America. You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, we begin here in Cameroon. You have been closely monitoring, you of the CPJ have been closely monitoring happenings in the Republic of Cameroon as far as journalists and their work is concerned. What's the situation as of now?
Well, again, thanks very much for having me. I guess one can only say that the picture for press freedom and the public's right to know in Cameroon is pretty dismal on several fronts. Of course, the one that concerns us particularly is the fact that Cameroon has the second highest number of journalists in jail in sub-Saharan Africa. Currently, there are 8 journalists in jail. We're also concerned, of course, about the fact that Samuel Wazizi died in military custody. And to this day, despite promises from government, we have yet to find the truth about what happened to Samuel Wazizi. His body has not been handed over to the family. And that, of course, does have a chilling effect on the rest of the media, because when you see that your colleague can die in the hands of the authorities and that there is impunity, that clearly has a terrible effect. And it is ultimately the citizens of Cameroon that are therefore shortchanged.
Samuel Wazizi, what do we know about his corpse at this point in time? The spokesperson of the country's Ministry of Defense said that the corpse was going to be handed over to the family, but as you indicated earlier, up till now, we have no information about a certain corpse of Wazizi that has been handed to the family. Nothing has happened at that level.
Nothing that we, all the journalists in Cameroon who have been asking the questions, know. You know, frankly, the fact that the way that this was handled by the government has been absolutely appalling. Let's not forget that he died in detention, in military detention. And we only found that out 10 months after he'd actually died. And why I say it's appalling is because that his own lawyers, his family's lawyers, the Committee to Protect Journalists, other media partners, journalists within Cameroon were asking the questions. We even went to court with a habeas corpus application to find out where was Samuel Wazizi. And it was 10 months later that the government announced that he had actually died in custody. And that, with respect, is unconscionable. And the fact that it is now more than a year later, right? Almost 2 years that we're still waiting for the truth. Enough is enough. Any government that respects its citizens, respects the right to life of its citizens, will ensure that there is some sort of investigation and that there will be justice for Wazizi. And to delay the process as it has been delayed by the government, as I said, is unconscionable.
All right. Well, hoping that the technicians will enable me to hear you clearly. You have been talking with the lawyers, certainly. Barrister Ule, you have been talking with some family members and other sources on the ground. What are they telling you about the progress at the level of the case handled by the Ministry of Defense?
There has been no progress, certainly. You know, even our attempts in court, and we continue. The Committee to Protect Journalists and the family of Samuel Wazizi and journalists in Cameroon continue to ask the questions and are seeking remedies through the courts. And even the courts have not been in a position to assist. And so, you know, the next step obviously is to look internationally. You know, if you exhaust the remedies domestically, you have to turn to the international community. And we have gone to the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. If it means that we need to find our own investigators to do our own investigation and get into the country to do that, then so be it. Then it must be done. But we need to be allowed access.
Of course, there are other cases like Paul Shooter, who has been in detention for several months now. We also have the former correspondent of a Turkish news agency, Anadolu, that is Anadolu News Agency, and we have many other cases who are in detention, some who have not been given the possibility to be tried for several months.
Correct. And so this whole idea of journalists and others who are being held in pre-trial detention, are being arrested and thrown in jail and effectively, with respect, left to rot. It's a case of where, it's even worse and even more egregious at a time where you have the COVID pandemic. As you know, people who are in prison are more at risk of getting COVID. And so these journalists who are there simply because of their work are at more risk and could die in prison. And we all know, and then the majority of the journalists are in Kondengui prison. We all know about the overcrowded conditions and how COVID-19 is in fact an issue in those prisons. And therefore we appeal yet again to President Biya, as we did when we wrote a letter to the president last year. We again appeal to him to do the right thing and to release the journalists. Journalism isn't a crime. These journalists do not belong in jail, and they certainly should not be held at the discretion of the government without being tried. And even when they are tried, as we have seen, some who have faced anti-terror legislation have been tried in military tribunals, which in itself is anathema. We have the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention that has found that some of these arrests are in fact arbitrary. Mancho Babiksi is a perfect example. And so again, for Cameroon, who once upon a time did not have one journalist in jail, to now be the second worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa after Eritrea, is certainly not a record to be proud of, and certainly not a record on World Press Freedom Day to actually be proud of. The fact that it is also the 10th worst jailer of journalists in the world is also something that needs to be raised repeatedly until the government feels ashamed enough to understand that to jail a journalist and to deny the citizens the right to information, to a diversity of information, to a plurality of information from journalists is in itself a violation of the fundamental rights of access to information and the right to press freedom and the public's right to know.
The disturbing case, Angela, is that of Thomas Awa, who has been detained for a long period of time under a very critical health condition, chained on his sick bed. What's the CPJ doing about this?
Well, Thomas Awa has been an emblematic case for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Again, we have assisted Thomas Awa in terms of ensuring that he gets medical attention, that he gets prison support, and we have repeatedly asked the President Biya and the government to ensure that it does the right thing. Now, someone with an underlying condition like Thomas Awa Jr. is even more vulnerable and more at risk of getting COVID in jail. You know that he is in Kondengui, in the central prison, that, as I've said, is overcrowded and really is a nightmare in terms of ensuring that the health of those who are being detained can in fact be assured that they can remain healthy. We have had journalists who have actually in jail who have in fact contracted COVID. My question to the government is, do you want a situation where another journalist dies in jail. We've yet to have any sort of justice when it comes to the case of Bibi Ngota. We're still waiting for an answer about what happened to Samuel Wazizi. Do we want another journalist to die in detention? Because that's the real risk that journalists who are in jail for their journalism face today in the year 2021 on a day called World Press Freedom Day, where we should all be highlighting the importance of media, how important they are in terms of ensuring that journalists, that the public has the right to know, that the public has critical access to information, and that they are not criminals. We do not have to, we say this repeatedly. I think ultimately, this crackdown on dissent that we have seen with the use of anti-terror legislation, with the use of false news, another record not to be proud of is that we have seen, in terms of false news convictions around the world, that the two worst countries in terms of false news conviction happens to be on our continent. First, Egypt, and second, Cameroon. This is unimaginable that a country with so much promise, that should be given its rich history of journalism and some of the great journalists that have come before all of us, that today, in the year 2021, we're still talking about 8 journalists in jail for their work.
Across the African continent at large, is there some progress that is made as far as the respect of the right to information, the press freedom, the respect of press freedom is concerned?
There are some bright spots and what one would call a beacon of press freedom. But unfortunately, again, what we have seen with COVID-19 is that governments have used COVID-19 as an excuse to crack down. And so, unfortunately, from my own country, South Africa, where we have a law that was introduced against, false, a regulation that was introduced in terms of false reporting or news about COVID, to what we've seen in Botswana, where journalists are currently facing trial, where you have governments who are trying to ensure that they control the narrative and that only certain people can be quoted. The picture is bleak. And then, of course, you have not only what we see in terms of governments targeting journalists, but you also have armed groups. Kidnapped journalists. In Somalia, you have Al-Shabaab. And just last week, you had two Spanish journalists working on a documentary about conservation being murdered in Burkina Faso. And so it's even those countries where we have hoped that there was going to be some reform. And I look at Ethiopia, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed became the Prime Minister, and you saw reforms. It lasted all of a year, and suddenly it was downhill from there. And so in Ethiopia, journalists are again being jailed. The anti-terror laws are again being used by journalists. We also see cybercrime legislation being used against journalists throughout the continent. And so it's again, and I don't want this to be seen as the Committee to Protect Journalists crying and out about journalists. What I need people to understand is that once you are targeting a journalist, you are effectively targeting citizens as a whole, because those journalists are the ones that are allowing credible information to get out to citizens. And once you see journalists being targeted by governments, you know that it is downhill from there, and it will be ordinary citizens that will also be targeted. And a perfect example is, let's look at what happened in 2016 in the two Anglophone regions. You had a situation where you had teachers, where you had lawyers protesting. And then you saw the situation getting worse. And the government used the anti-terror law in Cameroon against journalists and against others. You had a series of journalists being arrested at the time. And that was really what I would call the canary in the coal mine. That was actually sending the warning that it would be others that would be next. And that's exactly what we saw. And so we are, almost 4 years later, with a conflict that has gone out of control, with journalists still being seen as the enemy by a government that unfortunately is using the approach of cracking down on dissent, as opposed to looking at ways of resolving an issue that is really not only affecting journalists, obviously, but is affecting communities in these regions, and are seeing a major humanitarian crisis, displacement. And so if journalists are going to be jailed for their work covering, the Anglophone crisis, and the majority of the journalists in jail are in jail because of that, it is just sending a message yet again that the government is not prepared to look for a negotiated settlement, and that people will continue to die and to bear the brunt of a terrible conflict that ultimately is affecting citizens daily. And obviously the journalists who are out there trying to cover it are also in a situation where they are practicing self-censorship, because they know that ultimately they do not want to be in the same situation as their colleagues who are rotting in jail for their journalism.
Quintal of CPJ joining us from New York, United States of America. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Now to Kumba in the Meme Division, southwest region of the Republic of Cameroon, where the population have been encouraged to contribute to put their hands on the plow as far as the fight against insecurity within the context of the more than 4-year-long armed conflict in the two English-speaking regions of the country is concerned. And this call came from the Member of Parliament of Kumba Urban, as well as the Senator for the Meme division, and they also urged the people to continue working for the development of the area, as government equally puts in measures, means, resources to help in enhancing their well-being. Details in this report by me, Armstrong Sander.
Describing themselves as hunting dogs, the Member of Parliament for the Kumba Urban constituency, Honorable Talbot Lawson, and Senator Ote Ando Mufa told the population of the Yawusa Kwacha Kumba that their days of underdevelopment are over, as they continue to support the fight against insecurity.
It is the first time in the history that Yawusa Kwacha is going to benefit from third roads, and because they have been very loyal, we know what they did.
Is for the tarring of 1.1 kilometer road for Yawusa Kwacha by Medipat. It's a punctual. It's not a big project. It's something I personally negotiated.
A project worth 209 million francs CFA, which Honorable Talbot Lawson says will not end at the Yawusa Kwacha.
This is just the beginning. After the Yawusa Kwacha tarring, we are going to Bamileke Street. After Bamileke Street, we are going to the Mabanda Road. After Mabanda Road, we are coming to Kumba 1, which is my own subsection, subdivision where I come.
The choice to begin with the Yawusa Kwacha, which Senator Ando Mufa says is motivated by the loyalty of the people to the ruling CPDM party.
It's one of those things that I've noticed with my Muslim community here in Kumba. In all the elections that we have done in this town, they have supported the party, they have been very patriotic, and they have been loyal to us. The party that I support, the party that I belong to, and the party that I sent me to the Senate.
Announcements which were made during a ceremony to offer food aid to the Muslim community ahead of the Feast of Ramadan in Kumba. The people were also asked to continue to be part of the peace process in Kumba, which is a key factor for the proper execution of the earmarked project.
insecurity also dictating its own laws on the population in Cameroon's economic capital, Douala, and the mortal remains of a 30-year-old woman has been discovered in her own room in the Commando neighborhood of Douala 2 subdivision, and of course the body was discovered in a decomposing state. Inosenazi. We'll come back to that report of Inosenazi subsequently. Time for us to go out of the country to talk about the situation in neighboring Chad Republic. Military leaders in Chad who took over after the death of the country's long-standing ruler Idriss Déby Itno have named a transitional government. An army spokesman said 40 ministers and their deputies had been appointed. They include a former rebel chief, Sheikh Umar, who will head a new national reconciliation ministry, and one senior opposition figure, Saleh Kebzabon, said he recognized the authority of Chad's transitional government, and several other long-time opponents of former President Idriss Déby Itno were given portfolios. But other opposition figures say the military council, led by General Mahamat Déby Idriss Itno, son of late President Idriss Déby Itno, has carried out an institutional coup, and adds that they will not be satisfied until it appoints a civilian president. The announcement came out after the ruling military council had lifted an overnight curfew that was imposed following the president's death last month during fighting against rebels, and there has been international concern for the stability of Chad in recent weeks as a rebel group has tried to advance on the capital, N'Djamena. Talking Point is up next. We are receiving a political leader, Fabrice Lena, Secretary General of the Popular Action Party. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sir Babila, for having me as your guest this evening. I want to use this occasion to salute the efforts of journalists in Cameroon in particular and in Africa. We know the difficult situation under which they are doing their job, and we are in solidarity with them. We can only encourage them that better days are ahead for the journalists.
Difficult situation, especially for those working in the crisis-stricken northwest and southwest regions of the country, working in the midst of bullets flying here and there, and the atmosphere quite difficult.
Yeah, that is why we of the Popular Action Party we've had a lot of concern about the security of journalists in Cameroon. All those who attempt to uncover the truth about the government or government officials who think that all journalists must dance to their tune or report what they want to hear are treated like opposition politicians or people who are there to destabilize the state, which is not right. This has made so many journalists, like I've seen from reports of different media houses and journalists, some resigning from their job, the passion of the profession of doing journalism. So it's really a call for concern, but we can only encourage them to say they should stay firm, steadfast and resilient in the face of intimidation, because the responsibility of changing the society starts with personal decision of being steadfast in the face of intimidation.
Yeah, but this is something that is appearing a little difficult to understand. Journalists becoming targets, journalists targeted here and there, considered, as you indicated, as opposition politicians, as people who are against the government, people want to destabilize the state and things like that. Meanwhile, they are just doing their job.
Yeah, it is the characteristics of a collapsing government. You know, the state of Cameroon is at the verge of collapse, and the only means that the state can use is to mobilize the security forces and the instruments that will give them the power, which is uniform officers. Apart from that, they have lost the popularity in the face of the citizens. They have lost the support of nearly all the other syndicates or workers or professionals, be it the journalists, be it lawyers, be it teachers. So they use the only means available, which is intimidation, to make these people to do it the way they want it. And in this kind of circumstance, we cannot talk of democracy, because in a democratic society, journalists should be the least people that should be targeted by the government. So we keep condemning the action of the government targeting journalists. We've seen several cases, and the situation keeps on increasing. And we say that is very bad.
Angela Quintal was highlighting the case of Samuel Wazizi, whose corpse nowhere to be found till now.
Like I said before, when you look at the Cameroon government, you understand that there will be a point they will not be able to even mobilize the security forces that are standing by them. Because when you look at the difficulties that some of the young uniform officers go through in the southern Cameroons in trying to protect what they call territorial integrity of Cameroon, because of the rigid decisions of some people in Yaoundé who think they cannot talk with their fellow citizens, tagging their names, you understand that they are in a cycle, step-by-step process, mechanism of trying to make the state to collapse. Because you cannot subject people contrary to their nature and human growth for a very long time. They are going to react. And when they will react, it will always go the least democratic way. And that's what is happening in Southern Cameroon now. And if care is not taken, it's going to be national, because people are being fed up with what the government is doing in nearly all sectors of the country. In Yaoundé, Douala, and other parts of the country. I was recently in the north. I find out that the living conditions there is also degrading, and citizens there are merely surviving. So all this makes us to ask the question, to implore, to deploy ourselves and develop all kind of mental exercise as to be apprehensive of the approaching future where Cameroon is heading to. And we also ask the question whether the leaders really have the concern of the integrity of the country, or even to safeguard the interests of the country as in the components of the state, the population, territorial integrity, and the power of the government.
And concerning the security situation in the northwest and southwest regions of the country, Angela Quintal of CPJ talked about negotiation, and the Senior Associate for Africa Regional Director for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, Dr. Christopher Formunyo, said clearly that there is no way out except negotiation. The only way out is negotiation.
It is very clear. It is very clear, because we are now looking at the war at the face of explosive devices. And you could bear with me that as time unfolds, the people think to develop more skills, to be more tactical, to affront the government forces. And in this kind of circumstance, as they get stronger, the government becomes in the position of having no option than to negotiate. And in as much as the government stays at the position of saying the form of the state is not negotiable or whatsoever, it is just prolonging the process of negotiation, which is imminent and inevitable at the end of this crisis. And the people, the sovereign will of the Southern Cameroonians, at a particular time is going to determine whether they will want to live together again in the union of a different form of state, or to go separate ways after negotiations, after revisiting the gentleman agreement that brought the two nations together.
What is blocking this negotiation from coming from?
Yeah, it is the Yaoundé regime and the president of the republic, who seems redundant, and to me he is someone who is already incapable of performing his functions as the president of the republic, because delegating power to the Secretary General at the presidency is not only dangerous, but it's also illegal. And people voted the president for him to stand up and look to the citizens and carry their worries in his shoulders. That is what the president is supposed to do, to be concerned about the multiple crises that we are having.
The law allows him to.
He is not making any pronouncement as to the Anglophone crisis, there is that wariness to us political leaders as to the future of the country, wherein people are being driven to become more radical, and violence is inevitable when people are radical.
They'll become violent.
In this situation,
the law allows the head of state to shift some of his powers to the Secretary General at the Presidency of the Republic. But how dangerous is it? You said it's dangerous.
Good.
How dangerous?
Not at the time when the country is passing through security crisis. Not at the time when the president has overstayed in power. Not at the moment where the whole country needs the president to make statements on urgent issues and not to come out on his regular end of year or mid-year speeches in order to give a summary of what he has gathered as reports from his collaborators. That's not the way to govern a country in times of crisis. So we expect a more active president, and if he could not perform his function, the best thing for him to do is to resign, to make a way for Cameroonians to look forward to build the country. As it stands now, if the president continues in this manner of managing the country, we are moving to doom, and we may have the kind of crisis that we are experiencing in other African countries. And we pray it doesn't reach there. They should hear our message and readjust things before it gets too late.
Fabrice Lena, Secretary General of the Popular Action Party, we are sorry for the little mistake there on your title. You were promoted from the National Communications Secretary to the Secretary General of the party now, and probably in the nearest future you may become the president of that party. And why not the president of the Republic?
Thank you very much. As a young politician, we are always having aspiration to lead. That is why we engage in politics. Thank you for having me, Sir Babila. Have a blessed start of week.
Thank you. Same to you. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us. Equinoxe is up next.